Hi again, guys. I'm going to talk to you one last time today about Kant's critique of judgment. I'm going to try to make this a shorter lecture. I know I've been subjecting you to full 50-minute lectures for the most part throughout this unprecedented and difficult term. So we'll try to make this one shorter. I feel like we've had a really, really good encounter with this very difficult text, which I say not because I'm especially pleased with my lectures, but because I thought we had a very good discussion about Kant in a tutorial the other day. And as I've said, challenging though it be, we don't actually have an option in terms of whether or not to read a bit of Kant in a course like this one. And along those lines, just before we take our last look at this text and a couple of aspects of Kant's aesthetics, which again are very important and that we haven't yet entered into evidence, so to speak, let me just review very briefly what is at stake in and around this text, not only or even primarily for us as people who take an interest in the study of art and literature, but much more broadly for the history of ideas, the history of knowledge, and in that sense, I suppose, the history of the modern world in a very broad sense. Kant, as I said at the outset, is motivated and is working, as far as he is concerned, epistemologically. In other words, he is engaged in an ongoing, when he's writing this, an ongoing, very large scale, let's say architectonic project in epistemology, or the theory of knowledge, writing 3 long, magnificent, amazing, difficult works, which he calls critiques. First, the critique of pure reason, then the critique of practical reason, and finally, the critique of judgment, this one. And he's doing that, again, not actually because he cares, in the first instance, about art or beauty or literature. He does. At least he cares about beauty, but only insofar, I can't go that far, but primarily insofar as that issue, that topic of beauty, plays, as I've tried to explain as best as I'm able, which may not be very well. He perceives that concept of beauty as actually having a linchpin role within the overall structure and mechanism of his epistemology. And we've tried to explain a little bit how that works, or is supposed to work in Kant. But not to belabor that point, but I want to clarify or perhaps recalibrate it slightly. Kant is talking about beauty and about art here for the sake of math and science, actually. And for the sake of his larger epistemological project, which is, he thinks, to give a final and just decisive grounding to the truth of math and science. And by the way, we don't need to know in any kind of detail how that actually is supposed to work in Kant. I've sketched the idea a little bit. The idea being, of course, that it's in that encounter with beauty, when the world reaches back out to us. It's in exactly that moment that we know that we are in the world, and that in the last analysis, that grounds epistemology for Kant. But we don't need to know in any more detail than that how this is supposed to work. What we do need to know and keep in mind, I think, is just this general idea of Kant's project, which again is epistemological. It is for the sake of the truths of modern natural science and the mathematics that subtends and articulates it. So we were having a great discussion in tutorial about the aspects of Kant's aesthetics that we have taken on so far in our course. And a number of you were raising some really terrific objections against some of the ideas that Kant brings forward about how the judgment of taste occurs, about universal subjectivity, about those distinctions, those crucial Kantian distinctions between the beautiful, the agreeable, and the good, which, even though they are, I think, exceedingly smart and acute and sharp distinctions, they're nonetheless ones that we are certainly going to be able to push back against and ask some questions about. In short, we are able, from our side of the university, so to speak, we are able, without too much, effort, to, if not poke some holes in Kant, at least find places where we want to push back against Kant, and we feel that we can. We are able, without too much effort, to find some ways, in short, where we're going to want to say, hey, as somebody who really cares about art and literature, I don't think that's right. That doesn't make sense to me, Kant. And what makes that so, I think, extremely important is that Kant's view of these matters, which again he's articulating for the sake of the other side of the university, so to speak, for the sake of everything to do with the hard sciences and mathematics and so on. Kant's view of these matters historically was and has been just unbelievably influential, both directly and indirectly. So the history, certainly, of Western philosophy after Kant is totally in the shadow of Kant for a long, long time. And really, in various ways, even into the 20th century, under the heading of what's called neo-Kantianism, but we don't need to know about that. Direct influence, also indirect influence. We looked in our tutorial at Wordsworth's extremely famous poem, I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud, and I'm not able to tell you that Wordsworth has been influenced by Kant. I doubt that he has been influenced directly by Kant. I doubt that very much. However, Wordsworth is indirectly influenced both by Kantian discourse, I think, and more broadly by the whole presence in the culture of early modern Europe of these aesthetic ideas, which, as I said, Kant is not inventing. He's rather articulating and systematizing these ideas. So, if we think that in various ways Kant is wrong about the judgment of taste, about the nature of the encounter with beauty, about the distinction between the beautiful and the agreeable and the good, about the relationship between art and ideas, art and concepts. If we think that kind of stuff is wrong, what we need to be aware of is that for a very, very long time in the developing history of the modern world, not a lot of people thought that Kant was wrong about that stuff, and lots of people thought that he was right about that stuff. So we're looking at the Critique of Judgment at a supremely important text in the whole legacy, the whole tradition, let's say, of thinking about the nature of the experience of the beautiful, the nature of art, the nature of literature in the development of the modern world. If something has gone wrong, let's say, in how we have tended to think about art and literature in our culture. If something has gone wrong there, and I rather think a few things have gone wrong there. If something has gone wrong there, we need to know about Kant, because we may be able to trace some of the things that have gone wrong back to him. And having traced them back there, we then, I think, are empowered to try to make them go right, to correct these ideas a bit. Okay, That's enough by way of revving our engines today. Let's conclude our work with the text, dealing with some sections that we haven't yet dealt with. And I guess there's two things that remain outstanding for our look at Kant's critique of judgment. One's easy, the other is a little bit harder, but very, very momentous. The first thing and the kind of easy thing is just we want to kind of flesh out Kant's aesthetics via examples, because he gives us examples. For examples, I mean, of creative expression, of art, which sort of works easily or immediately with his philosophy. Kant's aesthetics, as you guys know and as we have discussed, is paradoxically, in the first place, not based on or about art at all. Paradoxically, Kant's aesthetics is based on and is about nature, natural beauty, and it's absolutely essential to Kant's theory here that we work from natural beauty in the first case. Nonetheless, he then gives us some examples, kinds of art that work really well with his theory. And so I want to look at those. That won't take very long. Then we want to go on and look at this other just incredibly important Kantian idea, which again, he is not inventing, although in this case, I think it is an idea to which Kant is giving a very, very important reformulation. It's the idea of the genius, the artistic or creative genius. And I added to the Canvas page just one example from the long history of thinking about the kind of people we call artistic geniuses since the 18th century. And that is the example of Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. I shared with you a little clip from the very fine Milos Forman movie from, I think, 1984 called Amadeus, which you guys may or may not know, but it's a terrific film. If you have never watched it before, it's really worth your time. The representation of Mozart, the person, I mean, that we have in that film and in the Peter Schaeffer play on which it was based, that's genius, okay? And the scene that I shared with you, it's a beautifully done piece of filmmaking, I think, although it's cut in the version that I was able to find and post. It's where the composer Salieri, who idolizes this person Mozart, whom he's never met, and is going to meet him for the first time on this one day in Vienna, very excited, can't wait to see what kind of person it is who was able to, write his first concerto at 5, his first opera at 7, or whatever. He says, what kind of, astonishingly learned and dignified and awesome person must that be? And then Salieri discovers that Mozart is a kind of cackling, bawdy, infantile figure, but with this incredible ability that even he scarcely understands. So anyway, we'll come back to that after we've looked at the text. Let's start then with the fleshing out, as I said, of Kant's aesthetics. And I'm going to look at section 16 in our PDF. It's on page 114. As we have discussed, Kant is one of those great philosophical splitters, and this section begins with another splitting, another distinction between two kinds of beauty, which Kant calls free beauty or adherent beauty. He says there are two kinds of beauty: free beauty, and we have a Latin phrase that Kant uses, but we'll just stick with the English, I think. There are two kinds of beauty: free beauty or merely adherent beauty. The first presupposes no concept of what the object ought to be. The second does presuppose such a concept and the perfection of the object in accordance with it. The first are called self-subsisting beauties of this or that thing. The latter, as adhering to a concept, conditioned beauty, are ascribed to objects that stand under the concept of a particular end. And we're right back into that very dense and difficult Kantian way of talking. But you'll recall that one thing, you'll recall several things that Kant insists about the beautiful in the purest sense, which allows us to have an experience of the judgment of taste in the purest sense. When we say that's beautiful, remember Kant says that it can't be the case that we get pleasure from that object first and then say it's beautiful, because then it wouldn't be the beautiful, it would actually be the agreeable. And much in the same way, Kant does seem to think that we can't have a concept of the object first and then take pleasure in it, because then it would tend toward the good rather than toward the beautiful as such. So it can't be the case that we, for example, first of all say, there is a rose. It is, I approve that there are roses in the world. This is a good thing. That's beautiful. No, because then we're already on the road to talking about the good, you see, the morally good in some sense. Instead, for Kant, we actually have to go, beautiful, rose. Something like that is the encounter with beauty as Kant seems to envisage or theorize it. Now, at the same time, Kant, he recognizes that concepts sometimes are going to be intermixed with our experience of the beautiful. Sure, Kant says, that's going to happen sometimes. But what he does, and he operates frequently this way in the critique, I don't actually think this is the coolest kind of move that Kant makes. But what he does is he just takes a step back and says, okay, yeah, but when there's a concept involved, then it's only adherent beauty. Okay? So I'm going to allow that kind of scenario, but I'm also going to discard it. That's not really what I want to talk about. That's not really what's at the core of aesthetics. What matters is free beauty. And remember, please, the very important role that concepts of freedom appear to play within Kant's overall aesthetic theory, most notably in that incredible and just exceedingly influential picture that he gives of what actually happens when we encounter beauty, which I was talking about in the last lecture. The beautiful thing causes a free play of our cognitive powers, very much like in the old Bugs Bunny Roadrunner cartoons, when the coyote, I don't know if you guys still watch these cartoons, so may have to look them up. But when the coyote gets banged on the head with an anvil, and there's a moment in the cartoon when he goes like that, and stars and little angels fly around his head. That seems to be how Kant theorizes the moment when we come into the presence of something beautiful. For a moment, we are out of ourselves. We are just smacked upside the head by this beautiful thing. Our cognitive powers kind of vibrate in that harmony, and that's the experience of the beautiful, Kant says. But that free play, an exceedingly important Kantian and neo-Kantian phrase, that free play of our cognitive powers, that's what happens when we see the beautiful. And it's consistent with that line then of his thinking, or that aspect of his thinking that Kant here again effects this distinction between free and adherent beauty. Adherent beauty is the kind that may have some kind of concept attached to it, but that's not what we want to talk about. We want to talk about free beauty, because that's what really matters at the core of Kant's attempt to theorize aesthetics. And then he goes on again to give some, I think, wonderful examples, and they really are very helpful for us to see what Kant's aesthetics is and is not about, if I can put it as crudely as that. What's a free beauty, then, Professor Kant? We can ask him. Well, he's going to tell us. He says flowers. Flowers are free natural beauties. So that's the kind of thing that he's talking about. those daffodils, those Wordsworthian daffodils, a crowd, a host of daffodils dancing in the breeze. Flowers are free natural beauties. That's what I'm talking about, Kant says. He goes on to say, hardly anyone other than the botanist knows what sort of thing a flower is supposed to be. And even the botanist, who recognizes in it the reproductive organ of the plant, pays no attention to this natural end if he judges the flower by means of taste. A very wonderful, very characteristic Kantian passage, I think, because it's the kind of passage, this one I just read, where Kant has, I think, either anticipated a kind of objection and moved to forestall it, or he's just so smart that he has already kind of thought a thought we might have by way of an objection. He's already kind of beyond us. The thought that I have in mind here and that I want to bring out now is there's this amazing paradox or conundrum in Kant, insofar as he insists that the experience of beauty can't be attached to a concept, right? It can't be the case, fundamentally, that we first of all apprehend a rose, for example, that we first of all say, there is a rose, I know what kind of thing a rose is, it is a flower, it has certain properties, it is red, it grows, it has thorns, some of them smell nice, some of them are symbolic of various things. Red roses are good for Valentine's Day, yellow roses are good for friendship. It can't be the case, Kant says, that we first of all go through that whole kind of, in our minds, that whole kind of Wikipedia of the rose, and then perceive it as beautiful. No, Kant says, we have to have the experience of beauty first, and only then, if we want to, we can proceed to actually think some things about the rose. Now that's really weird, I think, because it means, among other things, it would seem to mean, and this was actually a point that came up in our tutorial, it would seem to mean, for one thing, that the person who would be most, as it were, qualified to have a pure aesthetic experience vis-a-vis the rose would be a person who had never seen one before. So Adam in paradise, seeing a rose for the first time, somehow would be the ideal subject of Kantian aesthetics, and that seems a little bit weird, or even wrong, if we dare say that to Kant. I don't think we feel, those of us who have seen roses before, I don't think those of us who have seen roses before sort of take the view that we don't really want to see another rose, or that if we see another rose, we're just like, oh, man, how boring, a rose. I just don't think that's how it works. So that seems like a real problem for Kant. And then we might want to push that even farther and say, so what about somebody who really knows about roses? Oh, I don't know, a botanist, for example. Are you really telling us, Kant, that sort of the more you know about roses, the less you are able to appreciate their beauty? Are you really telling us that the botanist, in the botanist's shop, surrounded by all manner of roses and with a head full of wonderful knowledge about roses, are you really telling us that that botanist is less able to have that experience of beauty than the person who's never even seen a rose before? Kant in this passage, I think, is saying, well, not exactly. Not exactly. But Kant, I think, is saying here, I am telling you, or I am pointing out, and he's so smart, you see, I am pointing out that even the botanist who knows everything about roses, even the botanist is encountering the rose in a different way when she or he is talking about the rose's reproductive organs, for example. when the botanist is approaching the rose scientifically, that person is approaching the rose differently from when she or he is approaching the rose aesthetically. Even the botanist who recognizes in it, the rose, the reproductive organ of the plant, pays no attention to this natural end if he judges the flower by means of taste. And there, I think, Kant has very adroitly and brilliantly sidestepped the objection that we were trying to bring. Sure, the botanist knows lots of stuff about roses, and the botanist loves roses and finds them beautiful. But there's still, as it were, a different moment from when the botanist is thinking about the flower scientifically versus the moment when the botanist is struck by the beauty of the rose. Those are different, Kant says. And he has, I think, a very, very good point there. Okay, let's go on. The examples. We're staying on the same page, still on page 114. And I'm just going to read a bit more. Many birds, Kant says, this is just below where I stopped a moment ago. Many birds, the parrot, the hummingbird, the bird of paradise, and a host of marine crustaceans. I don't know where he gets those crustaceans. Why is that the example? I don't know. And a host of marine crustaceans are beauties in themselves, which are not attached to a determinate object in accordance with concepts regarding its end, but are free and please for themselves. Thus, designs à la grecque, by which he means abstract or non-pictorial designs. Thus, designs à la grecque, foliage for borders or on wallpaper, etc., signify nothing by themselves. They do not represent anything, no object under a determinate concept, and are free beauties. One can also count as belonging to the same kind what are called in music fantasias, without a theme, indeed all music without a text. And I'm going to stop there. There's more examples in this section, but I think we have enough on the table to work with. What are free beauties in art? Free beauties are aimless beauties. Free beauties are things like pretty designs on wallpaper or fantasias in music. So the kind of music when a composer doesn't really have a determinate idea, isn't maybe working to a strong structure, like the structure of a symphony or what have you, but just has a sort of musical doodle in mind and explores it as far as it goes. Kant, regrettably, lived before jazz and could not possibly have anticipated it, but he might well say that improvisation in jazz is a free natural beauty. A bunch of musicians following an idea in a way, but just in such a way that it pleases for itself. That's what Kant advances as the kind of thing, the kind of creative expression, whether it be in music or in art or in literature, that is exemplary, let's say, for his aesthetics. Now, literature, which is our business, of course, is perhaps an especially problematic area for Kant, and that means that Kant is especially problematic for us in literary studies, much more problematic than he is for those jazz musicians, for example. You can see Kant, and I like this little fantasy, you can see Kant hanging out in a really groovy jazz club and talking to the musicians afterward about what a great jam that they had. And you can see the musicians perhaps enjoying that chat with Kant. I think it is much more difficult to imagine Kant in a literary classroom bringing forward his ideas about the text, because he can't have any ideas about the text, you see? His whole criterion is whether it's beautiful or not. And he might well have an obnoxious professor who would say, yes, okay, but what about what Shakespeare appears to be thinking about here, for example? That's just not going to work very well for Kant. And indeed, he has this wonderful remark, which I'm just going to rant about briefly before I move off the point. At the end of the passage I just read, I'm going to read it again. One can also count as belonging to the same kind, free beauties, what are called in music fantasias without a theme. Indeed, all music without a text. All music without a text. What Kant takes for granted, but what we have to perhaps make an effort to recall, is that almost all music, up until Kant is writing, almost all music, certainly in the Western tradition, is accompanied by text or derives from text. Whether we're talking about sacred music in the traditions of Christianity and of Judaism, or indeed of Islam, whether we're talking about opera, whether we're talking even about concertos or symphonies, because there's always an idea involved in those pieces of music, and those ideas, of course, are expressed in words. And we could broaden the point even beyond that. Pretty much all art of any kind, up until the time Kant is writing, comes with text and is about text. It tells a story. So what kind of art, what kind of literature works for Kant? It's the kind without a concept, the kind ideally without words. And as I've said, that means that what we do is a problem for Kant, and more importantly for us, it means that Kant is, and always has been, you guys, Kant is a problem for what we do, for the attempt to explain what literature is for and what it is good for. In the Kantian legacy, as we saw from Pater a couple of lectures ago, in the Kantian legacy, the answer to our question, what is literature good for, is all too easy and all too comprehensive. It is there to be beautiful. And that's all you can really say about it. We connected Kant to Wordsworth, but on that point, of course, we could just as easily, and perhaps with even greater justification, connect him to Keats at the end of the Ode on a Grecian Urn, when Keats, after having spent several hundred lines of poetry looking at this antique art object that he does not understand, basically shrugs his shoulders and says, well, beauty is truth, truth, beauty. That's all you need. Beauty is truth, truth, beauty. An intensely Kantian thought. But it doesn't give us a lot to work with in the literary classroom. Okay, as usual, this is already going on way longer than I wanted, so mea culpa, mea maxima culpa, but let us skip forward to the one remaining area of our look at Kant. It's that little section that I asked you guys to read later in our PDF. I think it was pages 184 to 189. So we're skipping all the way down to sections 44 through 46 of Kant's critique of judgment. And I want to run through this fairly quickly. One point that Kant makes, this is in section 44, which is very, very interesting, and we won't have time to discuss it, unfortunately, but it may well be of interest to a bunch of you guys, is that Kant draws a very strong distinction between the world of art and the beautiful and the world of the sciences. And he insists there's no such thing as beautiful science. This is in section 44. So we're misspeaking if we call science beautiful. And that may be interesting and kind of irritating to those of you who are coming to us from the sciences or have a background in the sciences. It frequently happens, I think, when a physicist, for example, that may be the best example, but a physicist will frequently find a given formula and the way in which that formula elegantly describes and models the world, a physicist will frequently find that kind of thing beautiful. Kant is going to tell the physicist that she's misspeaking if she says, "Oh, that's a beautiful result." No, it's not right, because there's no beautiful science. There's only beautiful art. Another area to object against, perhaps, in Kant, although, as I think we have learned, objecting to Kant is actually a much more dangerous business than it may appear at first. But perhaps more to the point, and more of a takeaway for us, is that there is this rigorous distinction that runs throughout Kant, kind of under the surface a lot of the time, but always there, I think, this rigorous distinction between the sciences and the arts as just completely different worlds. So that's a very important part of the legacy of the segregation, let's say, of these two areas of our cognitive and creative activity, which of course still persists in the modern university and throughout our society. And it is a distinction which is effected, let's say, along several axes, one of them being conceptuality, having ideas, having thoughts, figuring things out. In Kant and in the legacy of Kant, all of that is handed over to the sciences. The world of the arts is that world of free play, free beauty, being gobsmacked, and all of that. And this leads us then to our last bit of Kant, and I'm looking at the time signature at the top of my little screen and feeling very sad that I have not managed to make this a short lecture. I'm sorry. So Kant has this vision of aesthetics, this theory of aesthetics as derived from nature, from free natural beauty like those flowers. At the same time, he has a vision of the world of art as another kind of secondary aesthetic world, which has to be understood as an imitation or a projection of the natural world. Meanwhile, and I'm sketching a problem that Kant actually has right now. Meanwhile, Kant is insisting that there can't be any conceptuality in that world of art. And yet, and this is where we come to the problem, and yet it is very evident that art is made by people. It's not like those flowers, those incredible English daffodils. And England, by the way, is the country of daffodils, you guys, in the spring. It is actually unbelievable. It's not like those beautiful daffodils just springing up because, there's those bulbs down there and that's what they do. No, art is made by a person, and clearly, and Kant won't deny this for a second, clearly a person making a piece of art is following certain rules, whether it's the rules of, the parts of what go into a symphony, or the rules of tonality, or the rules of rhyme, or the rules of pigment, or what have you. So how can you account for the whole phenomenon of art in a way that, on the one hand, connects it to nature as a kind of imitation of natural beauty, and on the other hand, protects art from any kind of conceptuality, even though the artist in creating is following certain rules? Well, Kant says, for that you need the concept of a genius. And this is in section 46. It's on page 186 that Kant introduces this concept. And I'm going to read a bit now, and then we'll finish up. Section 46, Kant says, beautiful art is art of genius. And he explains, genius is the talent, the natural gift, that gives the rule to art. Since the talent, as an inborn productive faculty of the artist, itself belongs to nature, this also could be expressed thus. Genius is the inborn predisposition of the mind, through which nature gives the rule to art. And the whole section here is important, as is the next section, section 47. I've highlighted a bunch of it, and those highlights are available to you guys in the highlighted version of the PDF that I posted on the Canvas page. I'm not going to read much more of this, though, because it's just taking too much time. Let's flesh out the idea that Kant has here, which again has been, without any question whatsoever, one of the most influential ideas in the whole history of thinking about the nature of art and literature. And I would go farther and be a bit more frank and honest, let's say. And I would say this is also one of the most counterproductive ideas there have ever been in the whole history of thinking about art and literature. The idea of the genius. In Kant, people who make art are born, not made. That is to say, the real biggies, the ones who come along and define whole eras of artistic creation. And Kant has a kind of secondary part of that idea where he admits there are lesser figures, and that would be most of the creative people in the history of art. There are lesser figures that come along and kind of work imitatively in the shadow of these great figures. So we talked about the movie Amadeus earlier. Salieri, played by the great F. Murray Abraham. That's one of those lesser figures who look up to and imitate the bigs. But the bigs, the Homers, the Shakespeares, the Louis Armstrongs, the Picassos, the bigs in Kant are geniuses. And that means they are born with a talent. Where do they get their talent from? Well, it's very simple. Nature gives it to them. And so Kant develops this whole picture of the genius as the favored child of nature through whom nature speaks. Among other things, and we mentioned the relationship between the arts and the sciences in Kant a moment ago. Among other things, this means that for Kant there cannot actually be any such thing as a scientific genius, which is very interesting, I think. Kant makes some remarks about Newton here in section 47, Isaac Newton. Newton being the intellectual god of the 18th century, for sure. Kant looks at Newton and he's like, well, yes, Newton is very impressive, but not a genius. And that's because, Kant argues, everything Newton did could have been achieved by somebody much less brilliant than he was, who just worked longer and harder. Okay, that's that's Kant's claim about Newton. Just a matter of how many hours you want to put in the laboratory, and anybody can be a Newton, Kant claims. But that distinguishes a Newton from, let's say, a Mozart, who is a natural inborn genius. And there is one more, quote that I do want to read. If I can find it, because it is very important for us. Okay, yes. Top of page 187. Kant is talking about the nature of genius, and he's both articulating the notion and kind of enforcing or trying to prove it. He makes a number of points, and the last one he makes at the top of page 187 is that genius cannot itself describe or indicate scientifically how it brings its product into being, but rather that it, genius, gives the rule as nature, and hence The author of a product that he owes to his genius does not know himself how the ideas for it come to him, and also does not have it in his power to think up such things at will or according to plan, and to communicate to others precepts that would put them in a position to produce similar products. What point is Kant making there? He's making the point which I think and hope will sound actually like a very familiar point to us in our course. He's making the point that the genius doesn't exactly know what he's doing. The genius just does it as though being dictated to, or as though the genius, the person, a Mozart, a Picasso, a Shakespeare, a Louis Armstrong, as though the genius is, the person is possessed by his genius in the sense of that talent that nature has placed in him and placed in him or her, forgive me, at birth. This is a model, of course, of creativity, a model of artistic creation that takes us all the way back to the beginning of our course. It takes us all the way back to Plato, Socrates, and his dialogue with the rhapsode Ion. I think that marks a very good place for us to conclude our look at Kant. Ultimately, in Kant's aesthetics, we are right back in Plato, and we find ourselves standing in the middle of the stream, let's say, of the Platonic tradition. That notion of the inspired artist, the inspired poet or inspired rhapsode, that notion of furor is at the root of Kant's notion of genius. And in a sense, all he's doing, Kant, is kind of updating that notion and bringing it forward into the world of the Enlightenment. Again, that concludes our look at Kant by way of reconnecting us to Plato. And I think that is a nice way to end, because as you'll see in the next lecture, Plato also connects us, the beginning to the end. Plato also connects us to the very last reading we're going to look at in this course, which is Erich Auerbach's essay on Homer from his incredible work under the very important title of Mimesis. Well, let's stop there for now. Okay, thank you very much as always for watching.